Hi, and welcome back to our graduate seminar in American Gothic Literature. This lecture is going to give you some background for understanding Hawthorne and getting into the House of the Seven Gables. Hawthorne believed that fiction offered an alternative, anti-authoritarian way of writing history. So he's trying to tell the capital T truth with things that are fictional or not true. He made fiction a key player in the ongoing project of nation building, what we now call literary nationalism. I'll define that for you on the next slide. Hawthorne's idea of national community is a community of readers across space and time. He's considered a romantic or dark romantic, but he can also be funny. And I just point out that funniness there because he makes jokes in the House of the Seven Gables that can go over your head if you're lost a little bit in the formality of romantic language. So try to loosen up a little bit and get a feel for his voice because he should make you chuckle a few times as you're reading. Literary nationalism. What is it? After the War of 1812, several writers sought to cultivate a new history of America that was separate from that of England via fiction. So basically, America was originally seen as following in European traditions, and then we had this kind of definitive break even after the revolution with the War of 1812, where we wanted to come up with our own cultural identity. The idea was that before that was that Europe was where culture was and America just mimicked it. But writers of the 1820s and sort of early mid 19th century were interested in thinking about what was specifically American that they could have a literary tradition that was based on, what was local to us. So that's where we get Fenimore Cooper's depiction of Native people, the interactions with Native people, shameful though we recognize them to be today in terms of colonialism. That was something that was specific to American soil. Washington Irving's depiction of Dutch settlements, that was another particularly American kind of homegrown and also a way of erasing the importance of that special relationship with England by focusing on the Dutch and other people that settled here, and Hawthorne's depictions of Puritans. While Cooper and Irving may have romanticized their new versions of America's past, Hawthorne didn't. He wanted America to confront its demons. Well, it's puritanical historical demons, at least. So he does not confront the history of slavery. You'll see the way that he uses what Toni Morrison calls American Africanism in the book. But he talks about that history of America's Puritan history and the shame of the hypocrisy that lived in that society as a way that he wanted the nation to grow. Just for an example of this from the House of the Seven Gables, this is in chapter 1. It's page 7 if you have the Signet edition, which I had here, but I don't need to hold up to you. No, wait, that's the wrong book. Yeah, I don't need to hold it up to you. Old Matthew Mall, in a word, was executed for the crime of witchcraft. He was one of the martyrs to that terrible delusion which should teach us, among other morals, that the influential classes and those who take upon themselves to be leaders of the people are fully liable to all the passionate error that has ever characterized the maddest mob. Clergymen, judges, statesmen, the wisest, calmest, holiest persons of their day stood in the inner circle round about the gallows, loudest to applaud the work of blood. So here he's pointing out that even the people that we think of as holy, the people that we look up to, can be bloodthirsty, and they might actually use their status in society in order to do dubious things, as we see in the book. So what are some useful contexts for understanding Hawthorne aside from recognizing his critique of Puritan culture? Today we tend to teach his short fiction more. Young Goodman Brown and The Minister's Black Veil are two examples of very often taught short stories by him. They're great short stories and I recommend reading them. But he published most of his short stories anonymously, and he was really more famous for his novels. In the author's note that introduces the novel, Hawthorne describes his text as a romance and explains what the term means for him, telling the truth but non-mimetically and with fiction. So why doesn't he call this novel a Gothic? One reason is that The House of Seven Gables was published in 1851, 53 years after Brown published Wieland, so there's a lot has passed. It was the second novel after The Scarlet Letter, and if you want to know what the Gothic looked like in those intervening years, I recommend Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I really recommend that story, and there's a lot of interesting conversation that we could see between that story and The House of the Seven Gables, or George Lepard's works of the 1840s. When I learned about the early American Gothic in grad school, we read The Quaker City by George Lepard. We read it in a week. It is a very big book. I loved it, but it's almost 600 pages, and I just didn't think we could fit it into our semester, but I do recommend him. The British Gothic peaked in popularity between 1790 and 1830 and was already less fashionable by 1840. The market started to be oversaturated by cheap pulp Gothic fictions that slowly evolved into the genre of horror. So, by the time that Hawthorne is writing The House of the Seven Gables, calling something a Gothic already can make it seem more lowbrow, and he's trying to do something a little more literary. So, if we want to think about different cultures of reading, I'll get more into the way people read in later in this lecture. In the 1813 to 1840s era, this is the era of literary nationalism. It's an era of short fiction. So Washington Irving, Hawthorne's publishing short stories, Poe's starting to publish short stories, Emerson's publishing essays and lectures. The 1850s is the decade of novels. This is where the idea of the great American novel is pretty much born. You have The Scarlet Letter, House of the Seven Gables, Moby Dick, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Leaves of Grass, which isn't exactly a novel, but it's a big, epic work of poetry, book length. Of course, short fiction continues to be published in the 1850s. It's still published today, obviously, but the culture of reading is changing. So looking at the way people read and the way language worked throughout American history, we have texts about contact and colonization, letters that colonists wrote back about the experience of colonization and contact. Columbus's letters are some famous examples. We have oral traditions that give us the Native American perspective of that interaction. We have the writing of Puritan culture, where you had preachers like Winthrop, poets like Anne Bradstreet, and memoirists like Mary Rowlandson, who think about reading as a tool for discovering God's design in everyday life. They actually are really into reading and writing because what they do for their religion is read the world for providential signs. And so reading is important to them, and so is the written word. We have the early Enlightenment era. We talked a little bit about this when I compared the Enlightenment to Romanticism in our first lecture. Reading becomes more of a form of social mobility here, a tool to navigate a porous social structure. Benjamin Franklin famously took advantage of this. He was not born with social status, but he used a lot of reading to kind of pull himself up, and that's why he was really invested in the idea of the public library, because then supposedly you could have this Enlightenment ideal of a meritocracy, which doesn't really work when you don't allow women or non-white people or people that don't own land to partake of it. But it's where some of those ideals of meritocracy and the idea that you can read to kind of pull yourself up comes from. Revolutionary print culture is the idea that reading is a political mode that can create consensus from dispersed communities. You can see this kind of in fan fiction form in the musical Hamilton. Then we have sentimental and sensational, which we talked about in our first lecture and which you saw in Wieland. And then we get to Hawthorne and other writers like Irving, where reading is participating in a wider market. And again, it also lets you gain one sense of a modified cultural past. I highlighted a wider market here because we have the beginning of an actual market for literature. Washington Irving was the first literary celebrity. Like, he made enough money to go dine on like 10-course meals and travel around just based on writing alone. That was pretty much unimaginable without a wealthy patron giving you funds and sort of funding you for the art before, to actually make enough money from selling your books to be a literary celebrity. We also have changing ideas about gender. Compare and contrast Hawthorne's women characters to Brown's and both authors' depictions of masculinity. You'll be able to do that yourself. I don't really need to tell you what to look for, but I will give you some context. We're reading Barbara Welter's Cult of True Womanhood. It's basically the idea that women should be virtuous, chaste, honorable, and innocent, and ignorant before marriage. that they should be completely absorbed in their husbands and family lives immediately upon marriage. This was a cultural idea that accorded with prevailing religious ideologies, and it was also upheld by laws like coverture, which meant that women could not own land or have legal status. Their legal status was covered first by their father and then by their marriage. A residual form of this ideal remains with us today when we imagine the virgin whore dichotomy, as we call it. So I mentioned the market. The market revolution begins around the 1820s. It's a change from artisans towards factories, and there's more emphasis on global markets. A good story that kind of gets at the heart of this is Melville's Paradise of Bachelors and Tartarus of Maids. I love it. Students don't seem to like it. You could look it up if you're interested, but it's a 2-chapter story, and the first chapter begins with these kind of wealthy people in England just like sitting back in the Temple Bar, and then the next story is these women in a factory in uh, in the Northeast. I want to say Maine, and it's almost gothic. They're sort of like working at the machine. It's kind of grotesque imagery. Somebody loses an arm in the machine at some point. And when you first read it, you're like, how are these connected? But you realize that the women are making paper out of the shirts that these wealthy people in England are wearing, and then that paper is being sold back to England. So it's related through the market. The market revolution also involved further exploitation of enslaved labor, and it precedes and leads the way towards what we think of as the Industrial Revolution, which is something that we teach more in high schools than we do the market revolution. This is an image of that depicts that market revolution. It's called The Times by Edward Williams Clay. You can see a lot of writing everywhere. There's a lot of print all over the place. And there's also a lot of poverty. So there's a debtor's prison. There's, drunkenness in public. There's poverty. Here's a woman and a baby who are sort of at the mercy of this drunk man. So the idea is that all of a sudden we have this boom in printing. The written word is everywhere. There's a little bit of an uptick in literacy, but the creation of this market also created a lot of, or exacerbated a lot of poverty and divisions of wealth. In chapter 3 of House of the Seven Gables, Holgrave the daguerreotypist talks about the role that the market's going to play in this book when Hepzibah opens her little penny shop. And Holgrave says, "I will leave you to feel whether it is not better to be a true woman than a lady. Do you really think, Miss Hepzibah, that any lady of your family has ever done a more heroic thing since this house was built than you are performing in it today?" I added emphasis here. So he invokes the idea of a true woman, which I covered before, comparing it to a lady, which is a term of gentility and status. So a true woman is the way you behave. A lady is your social status that's conferred to you by birth. And these things are at odds in the book. It comes up a lot. And he calls opening a store heroic. So giving into that market is heroic. And he marks time since the house was built. That house as a marker of the passage of time is really important as you read. So as you read Hawthorne, I'm just going to finish with a few things that I'll point you to think about as you read. Notice how he describes markets and selling goods. Notice how the omniscient narrator is not always certain of himself or themselves. We don't know the gender of the narrator, and it doesn't matter. Their use of the word perhaps, for example. So the narrator will say something and then maybe take it back. That's an important strategy that Hawthorne uses throughout his body of work, and it's worth paying attention to and thinking about what that means to you. How does Hawthorne engage with ideas about domesticity, physically in terms of descriptions of actual houses? And, this book is named after a house, so the idea of the domicile is important. And philosophically in terms of gender. And how does he describe the Puritans? What is the role of family and national history in the novel? And just as a side note, he changed the spelling of his own last name to distance himself from his witch-hunting ancestors. That's how much he really despised the Puritans. So I hope this lecture gave you some context for better understanding The House of the Seven Gables, and I hope you enjoy reading it. I look forward to hearing what you think.